you end up wondering, what kind of people are we? Not to respect a space of someone who actually was not just one of us, was not just an elder in a community, but in fact, one of our icons, our own Shakespeare. So we highlight examples simply because it is a matter of grave concern, because in general, in our townships, in our villages, you will find that these places are left to be subjects of indignity, and I would say disrespect, actually. It's a matter that we raise with concern as a matter of what needs to be done to correct it. And we believe that the local level of governance in our country, the managers at that level, the specific people charged with that responsibility, must look after those spaces on our behalf. Because for a family to end up having to remove those that are somewhere in a township to go put them with others that perhaps have been laid to rest in a more urban center is an indictment on us. Because when you get to the other one, Eseslungwi, you find that actually it is well maintained. And you can't blame those that maintain theirs well. It is how we all should be maintaining them everywhere we live, where we have our people to whom we continue to bestow the necessary respect and dignity. So we raise this thing, even though many times it gets highlighted only when it is the icons that we would be paying a lot more attention to. For instance, in recent times we became aware that apparently there was a vandalism case because of how the grave of the late president of the PAC, Robert Sobukwe, had been vandalized. We think it's wrong. We think it's wrong when it happens in an ordinary graveyard in a township or in a village or anywhere, but it is also wrong when it then happens to an S.E.K. Mkai or Tio Soga, whose grave I also visited, and I found a very high grass the other year. So I think that we show how much disrespect we have for ourselves by neglecting graveyards where we have laid to rest those that went before us, those that are our parents, and in fact, whom we loved very dearly. Our paper also raises the need, in particular for us as the ANC, to adopt uniformity when it comes to the specific task we have of continuously looking at those whose remains are outside the country, where because we did not have the resources to do it as the ANC, and back in 1999, we took the position that we would never be able to cope ourselves financially because we don't have those resources. But we then opened ourselves for approach by families, that if a family were to approach us to say we have so and so who's one of us whose remains are in Lusaka, you will have seen cases where we did arrange for the remains of different people that had been left in those countries outside where the ANC operated in the external mission. When they are brought back, we would cooperate, we would work with those families who would actually put it in black and white that they had decided that They wanted to fetch their loved ones. They were prepared to pay what was needed to bring their loved ones back. So it would never be an initiative of the ANC itself. However, the subcommittee would play the role on behalf of the ANC to be approached by those families, and we would be satisfied that those approaches were adequate in terms of the commitment that they would indicate, and we would then collaborate and have a program that welcomes the remains of one who would be brought back from outside the country. Only really a handful of people have been brought back in that way because, of course, as you can imagine, the ANC itself can't afford it. Even many South African families do not afford it. But also we have found that there are areas where we need to synchronize our approach. We need to not allow things just to happen. Where we found, for instance, there would be diverse ways of doing things from province to province. So it would be a matter of the province can afford it, so they would fetch their loved ones from whatever country where their remains would have been left. But we did come across certain specific matters that would arise that showed that we do have to pause and reflect and, in fact, tie up our approaches to these matters, because they do create not only agitation at those moments when then we would be about to have the event of receiving the remains of someone, but there would be questions relating to under which circumstances do you then in that province call on the provincial government to use the resources of governance on those cases. For instance, where you would have a person whose remains would have been already paid for by the state initially. When, for instance, a comrade was hanged, was initially buried in Pretoria, so the state paid. Then, after post-apartheid South Africa, they are relocated from Pretoria, where they had been buried by the state, by the apartheid state. So now you say, okay, it was not our decision, so now it's our decision. We bring that person to their province, where they come from. They go to a province. When they are already in a provincial center, you find that now within the family comes an issue of, no, the family would wish the remains of this person to be brought to the village. Nothing wrong with that. But the question that arises is, how many times must we, applying our minds very carefully, have the resources of the state deployed for the same individual to be buried, to be relocated, to be exhumed, to be taken to whatever finally will be agreed is the appropriate place. So it might sound like a small thing, but we believe it is proper for us to collectively apply our mind and adopt uniformity that will inform how we deal with these matters in the future, lest we again fall into problems that start off maybe as mismanagement or lack of understanding of what's involved, lack of initial reflection on the specifics that then later pose themselves. So we bring attention to this kind of challenge, which we will be able to discuss again for the first time in 3 decades. These kinds of issues come to collectives of conference. A second challenge we've come across as the subcommittee was when we became aware that a province was about to relocate the remains of someone who had been one of our most active presidents in our history. So it does turn out, of course, the province had been interacting with certain of our comrades here at HQ, but it had not ever come to the collective, which is the subcommittee. And of course, you know, the culture of the ANC is to do things in collectives, not to leave them to individual handling and administration or management. So the point we make there is not to criticize the families for wishing for their loved ones' remains to come home. But what we point out is when a person has been a president, they've served at the highest level they can ever serve in any organization or even country or society. And therefore, we believe it's not a matter that must be finalized between a province, a family, and perhaps somebody at HQ. It's a matter that must be well considered by the national office, and I mean collectively. I'm not specifying an individual or an individual office. So because we're an organization, we believe that things must be done organizationally. You'll realize that we have that language of things must be done organizationally, and therefore we think issues of a president's remains being relocated, in particular from what we regard as the center in South Africa generally, should involve the conscious involvement and engagement of the national office, which is HQ, and therefore we believe the NEC would bring the matter to the collective of the subcommittee that deals with the issues of arts, culture, and heritage. I think the last point in relation to this particular point I want to make here to highlight is that there's very important work we are doing in relation to the exhumations, relocations of remains of a lot of South Africans from outside the country, in particular from outside in the neighboring countries, into the country. As I've said, I've made reference fleetingly that it's an area where, as the organization, we were unable to afford. But we want to highlight to you that there's very good work that has been going on quietly, painstakingly, between us, and by us I'm talking South African delegations, and in those delegations you would have represented in governance, you would have the departments of sports, arts and culture and heritage, and the departments of defense and military veterans. In particular, the countries that we have been working in are Botswana, Zambia, and Angola. We've been in Mozambique, of course. We've also been in Lesotho, but in particular, those three countries I started with are the key ones where we do have what looks like is about to be ripe cases where we can confidently say we're at a point that is near the culmination of work that has been done. And in fact, recently, members of the subcommittee were able to go and join a delegation from the Department of Sports, Arts and Culture and Heritage that was led by Minister Nathi Mthethwa to Botswana, where the graves of some of our cadres that had been the victims of the raids, the South African Defence Force raids of 1985. The places where we buried them at that time were visited, and in fact there are talks that have been ongoing between the two departments, the relevant departments, which is called something else in Botswana. It's not the same kind of how they call the portfolio in government. In our case, of course, it would have been sports, arts, culture, and heritage. So we will soon see the culmination of the work that the delegations went just to yet again go and see the state of affairs as to how far the work had arrived in
rather than outward looking. But I think the government of the African National Congress, as led by Comrade Cyril Ramaphosa, did very well from that point. And following recent extreme weather patterns across the world, developed countries should not lose sight of their commitment to cutting emissions to the transfer of clean technology to developing countries. In fact, when we were having our own conversations, and recently we had a meeting with the Minister of Africa from the UK, we were saying to them, it's not just about what they want in as far as this issue of cutting emissions and a clean technology. It is also because we, as South Africa, we as the African continent, are very conscious of the fact that we need to protect the globe, we need to protect the world, we need to make sure that these weather patterns that are beginning to be a devastation, even on our own shores, need to be taken care of. So we have a commitment as far as this area of work is concerned. Closing financing gap for the development of infrastructure projects remains a key priority for South Africa and Africa. Recent commitments in fora such as the G7 should complement existing initiatives driven by the Global South and avoid the tendency towards a zero-sum game. Supply chain challenges have come at a great cost for the African countries, and the continent must support the development of regional value chains in order to have a higher degree of resilience in the face of future crises. Indeed, the global pandemic and the consequences of ongoing conflict in the Ukraine have exposed Africa's vulnerability to external shocks. It is also important to continue to encourage efforts towards dialogue in the current conflict in the Ukraine. And let us also recall that from the very beginning, when this conflict started, we were among the first to say we need this conflict to be resolved through negotiations, to be resolved through talking to each other, the two countries that are in the conflict, but also the entire region and the EU in particular, and the United Nations needed to look at it from a point of view of ending any conflict and any war through dialogue. As tensions rise between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, the ANC encourages dialogue and the peaceful resolution of existing challenges in the interest of peace, stability, and development. We thus encourage ongoing diplomatic efforts to build mutual trust. And here, again, as the African National Congress, we've gone a long journey since 1999 when it came to trying to deal with the issues of the conflict, but also the conflict in the DRC itself. The government put a lot of resources and a lot of effort into ensuring that there is peace in that region, because when all is said and done, it is about the people. And if the people are not finding peace, there cannot be any development. The ANC continues to call for an inclusive dialogue and political reforms in Eswatini. And we are not wishy-washy about it. We are very clear about where we stand there. While it encourages the implementation of the agreed political reform in Lesotho, it also calls for trust-building measures that lead to the lifting of unilateral sanctions targeting Zimbabwe as the country makes preparation towards elections of 2023. While respecting Zambia's sovereign right to form various types of international partnership, it remains a matter of concern to see the further expansion of the U.S. African Command into SADC through Zambia. That this, again, it's just an issue, us as the African National Congress saying that we need to have conversations and discussions around this, even with the government of Zambia. As the conflict in Mozambique continues to evolve, international partners must work in a holistic manner with counterparts in Mozambique to restore the immediate security challenges while addressing the root causes of the instability and tackling long-standing development challenges. And again here, as the African National Congress, we're very practical about these issues. We had a visit to Mozambique not long ago so that the ANC as well as Frelimo could have frank discussions around these issues, and as neighbors and also as liberation movement partners, how do we deal with this? Because we believe as the African National Congress that issues of governance are also very important, and how we respond to our peoples, I'm talking about the people of South Africa, the people of Mozambique, how we respond to that is of major interest to ourselves as liberation movements, but also our government. Having already entered the decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, we must double our efforts towards meeting SDGs by 2030 and forge developmental partnership with international community geared towards eradication of poverty. And if I may also add the issue of unemployment, and in South Africa in particular, it also includes inequality. Now, relating to the document itself, we deal with the balance of forces, and I've already indicated earlier on that the rise of right-wing tendencies at national, regional, and international levels across the world is a concern for us. Failure of the neoliberal international system continue to compound challenges such as poverty, unemployment, and inequality, conflict, and environmental degradation. And these are some of the issues that I dealt with earlier on when we deal with contemporary issues. Tensions between the US and China persist, affecting areas such as trade, the COVID-19 response, the role of the World Health Organization, China's developing country status under the World Trade Organization, the status of Hong Kong, and the South China Sea territorial disputes. These tensions weaken international cooperation while they may present opportunities for progressive forces to push for a more progressive new world order. I've already dealt with the issue of the Russian military operation in Ukraine, which has turned into an ugly war, with NATO getting itself involved through unprecedented supply of lethal weapons and unprecedented economic sanctions on Russia. The issue we are asking ourselves right now is what is going to happen when the war is resolved, when the country is awash with all these weapons. And we, from the African National Congress point of view, have been calling for the silencing of guns, not only in the African continent, but we believe we need to silence the guns even in the world. And we need to end wars, because ultimately the people who suffer most when there are wars are ordinary people. The larger Western support for Ukraine against Russia has a bearing on global geopolitics and has an impact on Africa and South Africa, especially in increased diplomatic pressure, and rising energy and food prices. I already dealt with that also. A significant number of countries continue to seek non-alignment, pushing for non-military solutions and addressing the root causes of war. Inconsistencies of the West in dealing with previous military incursions, such as the US-led operations in Iraq, Iran, Syria, Somalia, Libya, as well as Israel's military occupation of Palestine, have prevented many countries from being blackmailed into unquestioning support of Ukraine's military response to Russia's military operations. The bottom line here is that whenever there is a war, we must not forget about the fact that while there is a war in Ukraine and the support that is being there, there's still a lot of people who are struggling because of all the wars that I've referred to. The US dollar, like the US disproportionate dominance of arms supplies and military bases in the world, presents a threat to the birth of a truly multipolar world order. The ANC has to sharpen its revolutionary and progressive character and improve its ability to build effective alliances with a broad section of progressive forces in and outside state power towards a shared, just and fairer world. And here, as the ANC, I would like to also indicate the fact that we are very much in close working together with our alliance partners. And therefore, when we discuss issues of international relations and foreign policy, we also bring the alliance partners on board. The international balance of forces has a gender dimension, with patriarchal system remaining entrenched, while youth structures must also be empowered. We just recently returned from Germany as the African National Congress, as the invitation of the SPL, and we also engaged and went to Parliament and had a chance to meet with young people in Parliament, women in Parliament, and it is quite amazing that women globally are still struggling for recognition. Women globally, whether it's women in Parliament, women in business, globally women are having to go through that difficulty. And that is why we believe, as the ANC, the gender balance and dimensions from a global perspective, we as the ANC need to take it beyond ourselves in South Africa. And then we also deal with the situation in the African continent, and we say the actual balance of forces on the African continent and the Southern African region is linked to the conduct of governing parties in the region. Here's the bottom line. The African National Congress deploys those of us who are in government, and the African National Congress expects that we, those who are in government, we make sure that we implement the decisions of the African National Congress. We implement the policy decisions of the African National Congress. And we also believe that just as strengthening of historical relations among liberation movements in Southern Africa is an important explanation for region's dynamics, the weaknesses, and also explain such dynamics as slow implementation of regional aspirations. As liberation movements, we have to consistently engage and ask ourselves the question, are we still implementing, both from an internal point of view, but also from an international point of view, are we still implementing the reasons and decisions why we went out and fought and brought democracies in our countries, why we fought to end colonialism? And the reason why we did that was because we wanted to create governments that were going to be responsive to our peoples across the board. Continued efforts to reform the AU, strengthen the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, and the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD agency, implement the African Continental Free Trade Area, and achieve Agenda 2063. With regard to the African Peer Review Mechanism, we are also very excited about the fact that political parties themselves are saying when there is a peer review mechanism for governments, we as political parties must also have our own peer review mechanisms, and the process has already started, and the African National Congress has been invited to join the political parties who want to do a review on themselves as political parties. The signing and formal launch of the 2019 of the AFCFTA marks a major milestone towards 50 trillion rand market for intra-Africa trade and investment. 54 signatories, 36 have ratified and deposited their instruments as per the AfCFTA agreement. Here, as the African National Congress, we'll have to really have very serious discussions at conference itself about the opportunities for South Africa, the opportunities for business of South Africa, the opportunities for economic growth using this AfCFTA. The strengthening of links with the African diaspora as the sixth region of the AU should not be allowed to lose steam. This has been going on forever. I recall that when I was still ambassador in Brazil some years back, there were very strong discussions and debates about this, and especially at the time when Minister Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Comrade Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, was the chair of the AU. She really did a lot of work around the issue of the African diaspora to become the sixth region of the AU. The resurgence of violence in various parts of the continent is a recurring problem that has a negative bearing on the African Renaissance. Parts of North Africa, the Sahel, the North, Central Africa, West and East and Southern Africa have seen terrorist-driven violence fueled by cross-border criminal networks, the collapse of governance and national security, and the imperialist designs of major powers. The spike in terror attacks in Mozambique causes concern for Southern Africa with a direct bearing on South Africa's national security and well-being. One of the issues that we'll have to discuss as the African National Congress at this conference is the South Africa's own national interests. This document has been meandering around for too long. We are hoping that at some point it will be adopted, because there isn't a nation or a country that can be able to engage globally and internationally without ensuring that it has an appreciation and an understanding of its own national interests. The Horn of Africa continues to see growing militarization, with external powers growing their military presence in Djibouti. With this comes concerns that this turns Africa and West and Indian Ocean area into a zone for conflict and war instead of a zone for peace and development. The struggle for self-determination of the peoples of Western Sahara remains incomplete and is facing new challenges, with Morocco's attempts to drive a wedge in the AU away from its unity in support of UN resolution calling for peaceful resolution to the issue on the basis of the right of self-determination of the Sahrawi people. The Morocco issue, like the growing role of Israel in Africa, signals a waning influence of progressive African states, including South Africa, in African multilateralism. Because if we are not united as Africans here, we open ourselves up to a whole lot of others who sit and plot and plan against us. This fuels the perceptions that South Africa's sway in Africa has declined. Its role as championing the progressive agenda on the continent is seen as having weakened. South Africa does, however, continue to enjoy the confidence of many, as shown by its recent election to chair the African Union and the APRM, while it continues to chair the SADC organ on politics, defense, and security. South Africa has yet to put out for a public discussion within the ANC and the national interest document, which I've already dealt with. South Africa has finalized the hosting agreement with the continental institutions that are critical for the African agenda. The challenges facing Pan-African Women's Organization and Pan-African Youth Organization epitomizes our weaknesses as a motive force for the progressive agenda and regional continental integration. And then for policy considerations arising from the changing international environment in Africa and beyond, the ANC is expected to regularly reflect on the range of policy considerations going forward. It is also important to distinguish between the role of the party and that of government in relation to resolutions. The following considerations are recommended. Given the formal African Union resolution for the reform of the International Criminal Court, ICC, and the review of the Rome Statutes without withdrawing from the ICC, the ANC needs the resolution of the 54th Conference on the withdrawal from the ICC to avoid a clash between SA and AU positions on this issue. The ANC needs to reflect and review its resolution towards the downgrading the diplomatic relations with Israel in a fast-changing geopolitical environment, given the aggressive expansion of Israel in Africa, the intensification of brutal occupation of Palestine, and given what we know about the implications of this relation on in our diplomatic capital. However, we do indicate the fact that once ANC resolutions are taken, they need to be implemented. The ANC needs to finalize the national interest framework document in order to guide the implementation of our foreign policy going forward on the basis of our enunciation of enlightened national interest. Times has come for the ANC to develop a full economic diplomacy policy position, setting out our understanding of it, its parameters, its permutations, and its prosecution both by government and social partners, especially in light of growing investment drives, the operationalization of the ACFTA, the establishment of South African office of the new development bank of BRICS, changing international payment system following sanctions on Russia, the aftermath of Brexit, our role in the Indian Ocean Rim Association and the G20. Such policies must articulate with the NDP Vision 2030, but go beyond the envisaged possibilities of 2030. The new cultural diplomacy has gained momentum and growing beyond peripheral options. The ANC needs to develop a policy position on the elevation of cultural diplomacy due to its potential to enhance economic diplomacy, brand South Africa, and contribution to the arts industry. Arts in the African continent is one of the vehicles that we need to use for people-to-people relations. Noting the growing role of parliaments in world affairs and the consolidation of South African participation in this, the ANC needs to develop a clear parliamentary diplomacy framework to ensure that this is linked to other aspects of our diplomacy and that it encourages cohesion and concerted efforts across government. The ANC needs to give policy direction to government on the implementation of the decisions of the 52nd, 53rd, and 54th Conference, calling for the establishment of the South African Development Partnership Agency to place on par with other emerging powers. The growth of diplomacy of municipalities and provinces and the fact that this is increasingly being seen as an entry point for states seeking to influence our foreign policy, the ANC needs to develop a policy position that encourages a stronger coordination of substantive international relations work across society, alignment with the national foreign policy and cooperative rather than competing behavior among South African actors. We travel the world, we go to the world, and we have local structures, provincial structures, national structures going out to the world and are making agreements. And we want to make sure that those agreements are to the benefits of economic growth, cultural growth, diplomatic growth, so that people don't find themselves in countries and countries start asking them, why are you here when your national was here, your province was here? The ANC must form up its policy position with regard to the post-Ukraine war world, given the major changes that take place as a result of positions being taken by big powers on the war, including threats to the dollar hegemony and Visa MasterCard dominance of international payment system, and the diversification of sources of energy and oil. Non-alignment in global geopolitics is also taking on a new nuance and meaning that the ANC must reflect on. The ANC must take a policy position on the white paper that was withdrawn and decided it will be introduced, at what parameters will it be, what its purpose will be, what form it will take, and to what end. given the nature and character of progressive forces as we know them is changing even in our region, and given that the ANC is courted by various parties across the world looking for relations, the ANC needs to clarify its policy position regarding progressiveness and what parameters must guide decisions in party-to-party relations and solidarity. A simple example here would be that there are countries who supported us, or there are political parties that supported us during the liberation struggle. Some of them have lost the power, and yet they remain our partners. And now you have new parties who are in government who are wanting to also have strong relations with the African National Congress. So conference really needs to have a conversation about how are we going to position, how must we position ourselves in party-to-party relations. Noting the fast-changing geopolitics in Africa, division of Africa in some global discussions, and given the need to work to unite the continent around shared interests and progressive continental and global agenda, the ANC needs to consider its policy options in regard to enhancing its and ANC government's leadership and influence in the African continent. Our first point of call is the African continent. We belong to the African continent. Options that we have worked in the past, including the anchor state, butterfly and spokes and hub strategies that identify key partners in Africa out to build particularly strong relations to cooperate in influencing others to advance the continent's collective interests. And lastly, given the growing problem of tensions between immigrants, mostly from Africa, and tensions among immigrants from various countries, such as conflicts between Zimbabweans and Basotho, all point to a need for the recalibration of the ANC policy positions on matters likely to have a major focus for us in the elections of 2024. And in conclusion, also around this issue of the conflicts that we are talking about with immigrants, it is important for us to really work out and strengthen our relations, because we still need everyone in the African continent. We need to be able to talk to each other as leaders of the African continent. We need to make sure as an ANC that we influence also leaders of the African continent and ensure that they take good care of their citizens, and that leadership is very important and a focus at all times. Even if it's international relations, it's also got to do with the lives of our people, both inside South Africa and outside South Africa. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Lindy. As Mambalega has said, the African National Congress subscribes to the notion of collective leadership. So I've got representatives of the NEC collective here in front of you, members of the media. And I'm now going to open the floor for a question and answer session. How this is going to unfold is as follows. You raise your hand, we note you, you introduce yourself, and then proceed with your question. Can I note any hands if available? Busi, Natasha,
service, but in reality.
Okay. Natasha?
Thanks, Thomas. I have a couple of questions. Some are just clarity-seeking questions. The first just goes to Mam Balegamlete. Especially in light of what happened in Nobel, how much progress do you think has been made in pushing for a draft bill to convert alcohol advertising into a money bill with a levy, to fund sports, arts and culture? In terms of Manzulu, you touched on the issue in Mozambique, specifically Cabo Delgado. So in terms of your peacekeeping missions in the country, how do you plan on actually sustaining the gains that the country has actually made in that region? Furthermore, just to probably touch on Lucy's point, you raised the
Can you just go back to the second question?
Okay, sorry. The issue about Cabo Delgado, you mentioned it, right? So in terms of your peacekeeping missions in Mozambique, how do you actually plan on sustaining the gains actually made in that region? You further mentioned the issue of retaining ANC and its influence in the African continent. How do you ensure, seeing that the ANC is actually the oldest liberation movement on the continent, that you actually return it to its former glory? Or have you noted that maybe this is a trajectory not only amongst the ANC but amongst liberation movements across the African continent? Yeah, I think
Natasha, I think Mambalega did not capture your question quite well, so if you can just repeat yourself.
Okay. In light of the issue that we saw in your main township where 21 people died, how much progress do you think that the party has made in pushing for a draft bill to convert alcohol advertising into a money bill with the levy to fund sports, arts and culture?
Okay. Karin at the back there. If you can just speak up a little bit, I think most of you are very soft on the microphone. Put up that trade unionist voice.
Revolutionary.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be media revolutionary voice.
Sanitized here, masks are gone, but we're still being sanitized.
Okay.
Anyway.
It's a precaution.
Yeah. Anyway, it's Karina Kusi, a freelance journalist. I have a question from Mr. Zulu about the resolution around the Israel embassy. I'm just wondering, because you both said that the resolution from 2017 should be implemented, but then the document says it should be reviewed. What's happening there? Is there going to be a discussion again about closing the embassy, or is there going to be some push to actually implement that resolution? And then the other question, I heard you mention a document, or I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, a document on South Africa's national interest. It's been long in the making in Durban, and mysteriously sort of disappeared last year. I hear that there was complaints that it wasn't well written. Is this coming out after the ANC's policy conference? Is it dependent on the ANC's policy conference? Thank you.
Okay. A colleague next to Karin. Are you covered then?
Good morning, everybody. I noticed I'm the only one who wasn't known. My name is Unati Nanabalele. I'm from Cape Town, but I relocated to Soweto 3 years ago. I come here as a representative of artists in Soweto. I've been sent. As a result, I arrived late because I was only sent an email last night that there's something happening here and I must come and represent. The reason why I was sent to come here is that I am one of the people, if I'm not the only one, I'm sorry, I'm not the only one, but I'm the only one I know that has been making a change in arts and culture in the township. Sorry, I'm just so nervous. I come here as somebody who's been sent to not ask questions per se, but to relay a message from the artists in Soweto. Do you think that the youth are dying in taverns and all that? And I am a person who has been, I've been following this meeting since Cape Town. I attended an arts and culture in Bizo that was held, that was run by Nati Tetra a few years back, and I did get up and say the same things that I'm saying now, and they promised to get back to me, and they never did. And so I'm here again as a representative of the artists in the townships. I run a printing, I teach. I'm getting up because he's standing in front of me. I run a printing business. It's a printing school. I get artists like the youth from the township. I teach them to print, like screen printing. I give them a skill. And secondly,
Unati,
yes.
I'm going to assist you in this fashion,
Yes.
because right now we are only dealing with media inquiries.
Yes.
There's a gentleman sitting behind you wearing glasses. His name is Brazolile. And I'm going to suggest that you speak to him because that issue is directly linked to his office. You don't have to leave, but let's just take media inquiries for now. And then Brazolile is right behind you wearing glasses there. He's going to assist you with that inquiry. So can you hand over the microphone to Norma, please?
Good morning to everyone. My name is Norma Zinakosi. I'm a reporter for the Soweto newspaper. This question, I think it's directed to Minister Zulu. Minister, you were speaking of pressure that South Africa received in terms of the Russia-Ukraine situation. I just want, aside from the statements condemning the ANC for not condemning what was happening in between those two countries, I just wanted to ask you, just practically, are you able to give us examples of the pressures that South Africa may have received? It could have been maybe with countries that South Africa trades with in Europe, maybe some strict regulations that were now put in place that weren't there, could be with cooling facilities in terms of citrus being exported to Europe. But I just wanted to just get maybe like practical examples that maybe the SA government or the ANC perceives as pressure for South Africa not siding with one country over the other.
Okay. Pussy want to have a last bite in the front here. Yeah, I think we must start wearing name tags. No?
I just want to find out about your stance on Zimbabwe. You are calling for the end to sanctions and pressure to be put in that respect. And yet at the same time, we have South African Home Affairs that is basically putting an end to the permits, the special permits for Zimbabweans. Are we not putting in place a situation where you are sending Zimbabweans back to Zimbabwe to basically starve, given the fact that sanctions still exist and there will be a lot of hardship? Is that not something that you should be looking at?
Okay. So that will be... Oh, Avi. Okay, can you assist there? I think this is going to be the only round. There's quite a number of questions. Or do you still want to... we can do one-on-ones after this. Yeah. Okay. Avi?
I'm from ANC. This is for given that you're handling arts and culture. Do you believe the party is doing enough for artists? Given that even in your summary in your speech, you focus mainly on greater important issues, but you hardly touched on artists and the plight that continue to be exploited. And I'm sure this lady was trying to raise similar sentiments on the struggles that they face as artists on a daily basis, being exploited in the various industries.
Okay. Thank you very much for those questions. I'm now going to invite the collective that is here to respond to your questions. Okay, Comrade Obed will be the first one to respond, and then will be followed by Comrade Lindiwe and then Mambale. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I'll just take a few questions and leave Comrade Lindy Zulu to then deal with the other. On the resolution of the Israel embassy downgrading, when Mam Zulu said we continue with the implementation, is because it's still a resolution until conference. So in December, we are calling on the branches to start engaging and discussing it as they come to the conference, and then see if the review is necessary based on the balance of forces, but also other elements that are now beginning to occupy space, because we are an organization that analyzes, that believes in scientific evidence, that looks at the balance of forces at a given point, not forsaking the objective of the Palestinian cause. Today is Mandela Day, is our own global icon, and on Palestinian, he just said that Palestinians are not going to be free, South Africans will not enjoy their freedom until the whole of Palestine is free. We'll stand by those, our solidarity to Palestinians will continue, but the tactics in putting pressure and ensuring that Palestinian is free will from time to time change based on the balance of forces. So the review, therefore, is based on that element that branches must then bring. So the implementation is not contradictory. The resolution still stands, and we'll be able then to review. And if the review is done, then it means then whatever is the new resolution, it will guide our stand and our focus on helping the Palestinians to be free. And I don't see any contradiction there. And then there's an issue of, it seems like the one of the International Criminal Court. It's still an implementation until conference. However, so much has happened in between. There's now a talk for the reform of the ICC, which is something that was not there at the time of the resolution itself. The ICC was just stayed fast to say they remain who they are and are going to be implementing their mandate without fear or contradiction. And yet there were issues that were raising as the African National Congress at the time. Hence the resolution then was informed by, if they don't want to reform, if they don't want to amend the Roman statutes, then therefore the ANC will have to withdraw. There's no need in pursuing that very noble objective of the ICC. But that engagement and then also the AU resolutions has now necessitated that the ANC review its position of withdrawing, because in the AU it was finally concluded that the option of the amendment of the Roman statutes and also the reform of the ICC is an objective goal, reality that we need to follow. And the ANC is aligning itself, and government is involved in those engagements. But because it's a conference resolution, the conference remains, and it will then have to be reviewed. And therefore, I say to the branches, talk, discuss, as you come, look and then analyze the situation and the balance of forces, and as to why some of our resolutions, at the time informed by material conditions of a particular nature, ought to then be reviewed as we speak now. The document on the national interest, indeed, is still a document that is not yet released for public, and then I think the call is for that document to be concluded and be finalized as we go to the conference in December. So the policy conference will pronounce and then call for that, and then engage on a bit of it and say, can it be released? Because it's a very important document that is going to inform the policy on foreign policy of South Africa, on domestic matters, needs and an interest, but also the continental, the region, the continental, and also global. So we then definitely need that document finally to come out and then go in space so that it can really inform the policy dictate in the South African space and inform our foreign policy in general, so that people, when we do work in the global, in the continent, in the region, they will then relate that work to their national interest, which will then be elaborated in that document. And then I hope, therefore, that this call to government to release the document is necessary. I think let me stop there and then leave the rest of the other questions to Comrade Limbi. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Obed. Let me start with the question from Busi about, firstly, the lack of information, appreciation, and maybe even an understanding from a broader perspective of our own citizens when it comes to knowing what APRM is, what NEPAD is. There is a weakness that I can say. And that weakness, the difficulty about it is that it's not only even about our people, it's also about business itself. And I even want to say the importance of business and black business and young business, understanding and appreciation, particularly NEPAD, because NEPAD is the new Partnership for Africa's Development. If you take a step back to the times of President Thabo Mbeki, with the beginning of the African Renaissance, there was a lot of discussions and the formation of the APRM and NEPAD itself. If you take the period also of former President Zuma, at the time when there were lots of developments about infrastructure development, I'm sure you'll recall that there was the issues about transport, infrastructure from Cape to Cairo. There were very good discussions around the time of what needs to be done. And our view is that we did not, as the African National Congress, we understood that, we pursued that, but from a business point of view, it caught the fire, but the fire got cold somewhere along the line. And we believe, as the ANC, at policy conference, there has to be a further discussion as to, looking at the time that there was an introduction of both the APRM and NEPAD, what have we been able to do, but what are the policy weaknesses? Because we must also appreciate and understand that it's about the policy position of it, but it's more the implementation of it. And the implementation of it is about the development of the African continent, and the implementation of both these is about implementing the very program that the African continent has under the AU, the program that the AU 2016, is it? 2063, yes, 2063. So I agree with you that there's been a weakness there, and we are hoping that the directive of the conference and the discussions, and also we don't want to only have these discussions within the African National Congress, because it is not the African National Congress. It's the African National Congress in power, but it is not the African National Congress in power that can be able to implement, particularly NEPAD. The huge opportunities that exist, whether it's infrastructure development, whether it's air flying from one country to the next. I mean, we used to fly from here to Paris before we go to Senegal and all that. There's been a change there. And COVID-19 also, there's lots of lessons that we can learn from here, where the African continent was able to come together. But again, the African continent comes together. The leaders come together and agree on certain things. But when they go back to their homes, sometimes they find that the internal dynamics make some changes. It's the African unity that is important here. And the APRM, I think one of the reasons why there's this drive about APRM looking at political parties. Can the parties also start looking at themselves? Because there's no point doing an APRM on government and you, the governing parties, are not doing that. South Africa has will never withdraw from the African continent in terms of our drive for development, our drive for human rights, our drive for good governance, our drive for leaders of the African continent to continue leading not for themselves but leading for their people. And therefore we will not withdraw. However, I do want to indicate that sometimes our own internal dynamics, sometimes our socio-economic conditions, sometimes our own political space, we've got our own internal politics. And when I'm talking about our own internal politics, we're not talking about the politics just of the ANC. We're talking about the politics of South Africa overall. But the message that we would want, and hopefully when conference rises and makes the statements, it will prove that we're not in the African continent just for lip service, because we believe that the development of South Africa on its own, without the development of the rest of the countries, is meaningless for the entire continent. You'll recall that also former President Thabo Mbeki used to talk about the fact that South Africa should not be proud in its development in the sea of poverty, because that was about ensuring that united, the African leaders must be united. And that African Renaissance, beginning of the African Renaissance, was a very good thing for the African continent. But we must also appreciate, as I said, the internal dynamics, not only of South Africa, but of the different countries, not only the dynamics, even the dynamics of the regions, and even the dynamics of economic development. You know, the challenges between the value chain itself. Where do we import, export? Do we still export our raw material and get it back to us at high price? Do we still want to see that or not? But just in giving you an answer there is that from the point of view of the NEC subcommittee, we have said that there must be dynamic engagement at conference, and we must be very clear. One of the things we've said we need to actually improve on, we said we must discuss at conference economic diplomacy. We even said we are going to have a roundtable discussion on economic diplomacy before we even go to conference, because it's always about the economy. If you don't grow the economy, then you are going to be in trouble, because your unemployment, your inequality also continues. But we also think that other organizations, even your NPOs and your NGOs, we work with quite a number of NGOs like SAILO and others who assist. Even from an academic point of view, there are organizations that we work with, institutions, whether it's VETS or others that we work with, to make sure that they appreciate and understand our policy positions, but they also help us to popularize these policy decisions. With regard to Cabo Delgado, peacekeeping, remember that from a government point of view, South Africa has been one of the leading countries in peacekeeping in the African continent. We have in Cabo Delgado, we still have in DRC, we still have, but of course again, our own socio-economic and economic challenges have got an impact on where we decide, when we decide, where do our soldiers go, because it is very costly. While it is costly, the United Nations also comes through, because they have to pay for some of the deployments that we have. But many a times we end up having to spend and wait for the time before that payment is being done. Karin, I think your question has been asked by Comrade Obed, including the issue of the national interest document. We worried ourselves as the ANC why the document has taken this long. We are very clear about the fact that this cannot go on any longer. Once the ANC has made a decision that we need to adopt this document, the document has to be adopted, and I'm sure that the comrades are going to be upset with us actually when we get to conference and find that this document has been meandering for a very long time. Like I indicated earlier on, no nation will go on an international and have international relations and have bilateral relations without its own document that clearly stipulates what its national interests are. Unathi, thank you very much for having come through, even though this is a press briefing, but this is the African National Congress. You're welcome to come at times like this and always feel very comfortable, and don't be nervous about it, because what you stand for is something that I think Sis Balega will respond to, and we've already connected you to the person that has to deal with this. And also I just want to say to you, arts and culture and sports and all is international. So whatever relations we have with other countries, the arts and the culture, part of it comes in. But also we've seen from other countries that have used arts and culture to influence behavioral change within their own communities, but also connecting people to people. And therefore that can be answered. And I think the other challenge is that maybe when the subcommittee that deals with it, and Minister Nathi Mthethwa sits in that subcommittee of social transformation. When social transformation makes presents that paper, I'm sure you'll be able to get an answer with regard to that. But for now, you will be assisted by the comrades who are here. Norma, the pressure on SA we received. Well, let me start by the fact that we received the pressure right here at home. You will recall that when the African National Congress made its statements, it was even the opposition that stood up and said we are wrong in our approach in talking about peace, in talking about negotiations. They said we are wrong, we must really jump on the side and be on the side of Ukraine. And we explained thoroughly that as far as we are concerned, there are two sides of the conflict, and we need to engage. And I'm sure you're aware of the fact that President Cyril Ramaphosa himself has been engaging on both sides. Even here at home, we had a meeting, not even just we. I had a meeting with the ambassador of Russia. I had a meeting with the ambassador of Ukraine, because we needed to have an appreciation from both sides. And our call even to them remained the same. We need peace. We need to make sure that the war ends. And you know that at the United Nations itself, it was the government of the African National Congress that was voting. The pressure that was there on their ambassador, on our diplomats, wherever they are. We were now just in Germany, and our ambassador came to have a meeting with us to tell us exactly the pressures that he was getting. You know, when you're an ambassador, you are in a place and there's this and there's pressure. Even when you go to the cocktails and the dinners where things happen, where discussions happen, you can feel the air when you get there, whether they want you to be there or they don't want you to be there. I've been there. I know exactly what it is. But also because as South Africa, we are open to discussions. You see, right now you have the issues of grain, you have the issues of oil, you have the issues of petrol. The United States wanted to actually, it's in the process of a legislative process that is supposed to be looking at the countries that are having relations with Russia. That on its own is pressure. It's very practical pressure, because if they are going to be targeting people who are in business with Russia, we know a lot of South Africans across the board have got businesses with Russia. Some big businesses have got relations with Russia. And obviously it means once the United States make a particular decision on those that have a business relations with Russia, it will impact on their businesses. And those just are practical things that I can talk about. Even the outside pressure of saying President Cyril Ramaphosa must be seen to be speaking to the president of Ukraine, must be seen to be speaking to the president of Russia. It is pressure enough that, because look where it is and look at where we are. But what is happening there has got an impact. It is also pressure for us because a lot of countries globally, whether it's in Asia or Latin America and so forth, and also our role within BRICS, we were expected to be seen and be heard about what we say with the conflict in Russia. It's still panning itself out, if I may say that to you, because the sanctions themselves, we are yet to sit down and look at the impact of the sanctions on Russia and how those sanctions will impact on us. So I think those are just a few practical examples, including the fact that the oil prices have gone up and therefore it has impact on us. Food prices are going up and that has got impact on ordinary people. Busi, you go again back to, okay, Cabo Delgado. Piece, I think I've answered that, but also I wanted to make the emphasis of the fact that as the ANC, we believe if we are united as liberation movements and we speak in one language and we support each other, and even if we had to deploy in Cabo Delgado, in Mozambique, there should have been and there should be a SADC agreement on the deployment, because South Africa also cannot take that burden on its own. It needs the other partners to do so, but the leaders themselves must be in understanding, must be in appreciation, and the leaders in Mozambique, the party in Mozambique and the government in Mozambique, because it's something happening in Mozambique, but it has an impact on us. When it comes to Zimbabwe, you're speaking about the sanctions. Yes, sanctions, we've been calling for the ending of the sanctions for a very long time. I happen to be one of those people who were part and parcel of delegations that went some years back, as agreed upon by SADC, to send delegations to the US to talk about the sanctions, to London to talk about the sanctions, to Brussels to talk about the sanctions. I was part and parcel of that delegation more than almost 10 years ago or so, but the sanctions are still there. Zimbabwe itself has been calling for the sanctions. I'm very much aware of the fact that they have been traveling also to other countries that have sanctioned Zimbabwe to call for the lifting of sanctions. When it comes to the issue of home affairs, and you were saying maybe we're sending Zimbabweans back to starve, as the African National Congress, we believe that all countries need to take responsibility of their citizens, first and foremost. We take responsibility of our citizens. We make sure that despite the challenges that we have of poverty, unemployment, and inequality, we shouldn't be having South Africans leaving South Africa with almost nothing, leaving South Africa and going to neighboring countries to go and look for greener pastures when there aren't even that much of the greener pastures that we can talk about. So we believe that our engagement, particularly at a party-to-party level, ZANU-PF and the African National Congress, need to continue in saying there's got to be peace, stability, there's got to be that freedom of people to belong to wherever they want, which party they want to belong to. And the elections are upcoming. We want to engage and say we don't want to see continuous violence against anybody, even in Zimbabwe itself. And obviously, we are respectful of the fact that that's a sovereign state. Whether we like it or not, it is a sovereign state. They make their decisions, but we are conscious when those decisions are being made, those decisions must have a positive impact on us too, as South Africa. So I can tell you that many Zimbabweans don't necessarily enjoy being here. I don't think there's anyone who would enjoy just packing their bags and going and living in another country, leaving the comfort of their homes and the comfort of their country, if the conditions in their countries are also conducive for them. So in our discussions with ZANU-PF, we continue to engage with that, to say, let us all collectively create conducive environments for our people, so that when we have this people-to-people relationship, it's got to be people-to-people without others feeling like they are being pinched, without feeling like, oh, we've got too many Zimbabweans here in the country, they should be in their home. We need other countries to help us deal with the issue of immigration and immigrants. We need them to also appreciate that we are also under extreme pressure because the economy of our country is also not doing very well. And again, when the other committee's report, you will get more information on this, particularly coming from Minister Mtsoaledi himself, because the whole Home Affairs process is there, and it's in that class. That cluster has not made its presentation yet. Yeah. So look out for that time, and Minister Mtsoaledi would be able to explain even much more articulately than I am doing. I'm just giving a general picture of it. Thank you very much. I think I covered all the questions. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. I'd like to start by welcoming Unathi, who came on behalf of the artists. Even though we didn't allow you to elaborate on the issues, tell them we are listening, we are prepared to listen, and indeed we are open to hearing what you have to say. I need perhaps in that context to point out that these briefings are actually part of what we do at this point in the cycle of governance. In other words, we are a party that has been implementing certain policies, that has been doing certain things that it committed to earlier on in the things that we've been doing since democratic dispensation. So we did intend having a National General Council where we would have had an opportunity to review what has worked well, what has not worked well, and indeed it's part of that process for us to get in touch and tap into those sectors in society that would be relevant for the different portfolios. And therefore, it's important for me to point out that in actual fact, we do keep in touch. I think it was the gentleman over there who was talking about artists and what about them. And indeed, my highlighting of issues did not talk about artists. We do then, as part of that cycle, at that moment when the ANC is preparing itself to go back to its own gatherings of looking at what has worked and what has not worked well and what changes need to be made, indeed get in touch with the relevant sectors. So we keep in touch with artists. We are aware, in fact, when earlier we were beginning the process of crafting our paper, we contacted artists, we were informed by them of what are the key issues that they wanted highlighted as matters of urgent attention. But I want to explain why archives, the subcommittee that I chaired, because I'm not the person that chairs the portfolio committee, the subcommittee of the NEC that Lindiwe was talking about, which is the social transformation. But what happened is that in the history of the work that we do, archives is obviously more focused on ensuring the capturing and the proper preservation and the proper arrangements being made to look after the accessibility of the history, of the historical record of the organization. So archives was started, in fact, historically by Mamufrili Jinwala. And the records were taken by our former President Mandela to Fort Hare so that professionals can look after them. So we are the subcommittee that keep an eye on that exercise of ensuring the right approach on how we keep and look after our archives and what happens and what policies, and of course that's work that we've even taken to a non-partisan level, which is a story for a different forum, not this one. But as archives was doing its work some years back, the National Executive Committee of the ANC saw it fit and actually tasked that subcommittee to be the one that pursues the issues that were arising in the bilateral relations which we had with Botswana. So it is in that respect that we started getting involved on issues relating to remains of our fallen comrades and started being drawn into those matters. Also, when it comes to the issues of how our own approach to matters of receiving remains from outside the country, what arrangements, what kinds of activities get organized, all of those matters started becoming our responsibility as the subcommittee dealing with our history, with our historical records. And so archives started more and more being involved with those issues of what are the sensitivities, what are the correct things where we need to strengthen ourselves, what are the wrong things we see happening. So we started picking up all these matters, and therefore that's where we also realized that issues of culture generally, issues of the arts, are also part of what we as individuals that were sitting as a collective in the subcommittee were concerned with. So in other words, we saw it okay to continue dealing with those matters as they naturally came up and came to us. But we keep in touch with what the discussions are in the Social Transformation Committee that is yet to come before you. So I thought I should welcome Unati and congratulate you, Unati, for your initiatives, because even with the little that you have said, it's clear that you are doing a lot and you are not a person that sits around and waits for things to happen from somewhere else. I want to move on to the question of the APRM simply because I have the perspective of an insider, having also at a certain point spent 2 years inside the APRM process. I want to say that it is a process indeed that would not be well known by most South Africans, but I think it's an initiative from visionary leaders of the time when the NEPAD was crafted by in particular led by President Obasanjo and President Thabo Mbeki then. And NEPAD gave birth to the APRM as part of that mechanism that helps members of the collective of Africa, the continent, to help one another by indeed getting into the business that we normally tend to want to live as the sovereignty of a country. But sometimes you can allow a person to be killed next door because you tell yourself it is a personal matter. How personal is it, and how correct is it to be left to that space of being personal, to leave a person being killed next door? That's the question, I think, that arose at that time. And therefore, as the AU Constitutive Act was crafted, it started having this nuance of saying, as opposed to a past where the issues of what's going on next door are sovereign matters and we don't interfere in that sovereignty. But in this era, we're saying, no, let's allow ourselves, but in an orderly fashion. Hence, this mechanism that is called the Africa Peer Review Mechanism. So peers have a right for you to have received a delegation from the APRM that comes to your country. You would have arranged, they don't just pounce on you. You make the necessary arrangement, you arrive there, and you meet properly in an orderly fashion different sectors in that society of that country. And interact with people, say the youth. Allow the youth to talk about what's going on in that society. Are they feeling that they are participants, fairly equal, on equal terms as everybody else? The women, the business sector, many different sectors. So you are outsiders, but you are allowed in an orderly fashion to come in and see for yourself, kind of having a perspective that gives you that advantage of being a step back from a person who's an insider and a participant every day, because those participants of every day who are always at each other's throats as political parties and so on, it's difficult to see where you are wrong. You do need the next door neighbor to come and listen and say, I do think you should wait a bit, maybe here and there. So that report by the delegation that would have come into that country goes not to you. You are given the report, a copy of the report, but it goes to be discussed by the peers at AU level. So the ministers of foreign affairs, they are usually called that, would have looked at it, and finally it sits before the summit of heads of states. So those are the peers of the person who heads this country that would have been reviewed. So it's an African solution to an African situation that was arrived at mutually, and people are not forced to join the APRM mechanism. They themselves decide that they are signing in. They do want to be peer reviewed. So they invite the APRM delegation to come in. I think it's a good experience. And when South Africa had its first review, it's always made an example, because when we were being initiated into the APRM as new people, participant commissioners, I think were called, we were made an example that we were not happy with the report that had come out of that review. I think we've been talking about the second review as South Africa, and I think we should concern ourselves as South Africans to understand the processes, to see how well organized for that process of reviewing ourselves when it does come around a second time to be successful, because it's only a reflection of what the collective of Africans would have come and found, and a summary of how they believe we can improve on our own internal matters. There was a question relating to legislation that is relevant in terms of incidents like Enyobeni. I wouldn't know the specifics, the technical detail of what legislation is in front of Parliament right now. I did retire, by the way. I'm retired, I'm no longer working in Parliament. So I don't know the detail of legislation, but I must say Enyobeni is the kind of incident we don't want in our society, in our public space. We don't want 13-year-olds going into bars and ending up dying there. You know, you ask yourself, what is a 13-year-old doing in that space? So now I'm talking as a grandmother at this point. So that's just what I am able to come back with on the basis of clarifying some of the questions that were asked. Thank you very much.
Just the issue that I nearly said the speaker. Look, this issue for us, if I may, from a social development point of view, is of major concern to us. It makes us really look deeper into the different areas of legislation that's related to taverns, that's related to health, that's related to substance abuse. We are looking into it as a department, and we've picked this one up particularly because we believe that almost the same way that there was a fight against smoking in public and all that in public, we might just as well pick on this one up very seriously because it's got devastating impact on behavioral change, it's got a devastating impact on young people, it's got devastating impact on communities in general, and we want to look at it broadly from a point of even the taverns which they've been spoken about, and I think the President himself, Minister of Home Affairs, of Health and all, they're talking about why must we have so many taverns within a short radius within our communities. Why must we do that? That needs to change, and it needs to change drastically if we are to build a better South African, because the better South Africa is about infrastructure and all that, but the better South Africa is the individual we must start with and not start too late about the individual. So I'm telling you right now, from a social development point of view, we're taking this up very seriously. We're gonna, we know we're gonna have a fight because some people would say, yeah, jobs, people are gonna lose jobs. I'm here to say, yes, we want to create the jobs. There are many ways of creating the jobs, but do we really want to be a nation, to be known to be number whatever, top in terms of alcohol consumption? I don't think so. I really, really don't think so. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the leadership for availing yourselves for this interaction. And thank you very much to you, members of the media, for attending as well. This brings us to the end of this media engagement. Those that have got one-on-one requests, please let's talk urgently before the leadership leaves the podium. Thank you very much.
Confirm with Thomas and Sean, so that, hey, are you guys in the business?